it's inform, investigate, and inspire. Cast your eyes with joy over the roundel that you see before you and look at the proportions, particularly. I think that's interesting. So the inform side, the preliminary side of the conversation, maybe investigate is finding out as much as we can about the client. And then the inspire is when we start talking about the solutions that we may be able to offer to our clients. But it's the proportions that I think are interesting and counterintuitive. And many of you will have participated in meetings where the inform talking about us is the 78 slides about how wonderful we are as individuals or organizations and credentializing ourselves. And we would say, pare that back to the bare minimum. Of course, we need to have credibility and we need to credentialize ourselves. But if we can pare that back to the minimum, because the good stuff is getting beneath the waterline with our clients in the investigate side of the conversation. That's where the art, the craft, that's where the real value for our clients and for us is on the investigate side. So something around that. So we are limited and disciplined around the inform and inspire side, which for some people might be seen as counterintuitive, maybe not for you. So what we're going to do in the course of this session is take you through some detail, and I will be honest with you. Why wouldn't I be honest with you? The gnarly bit, the chewy bit, if you like, is particularly the inform side of the conversation. So we'll go through that in quite some detail because the other aspects, I think, are somewhat easier for us. So let's start then at the very beginning, as the song says. It's a very good place to start. Inform. Nominally, we're saying 10 minutes now. We're not going to be strict about that, but you can see that there's something of a proportion, a relatively short period of time. So what we're going to cover in the inform side? Well, the first thing that we would advocate is building rapport. What do we mean by rapport? Rapport is that wonderful thing, that bond that we have between our fellow human beings, that sense that we can engage with people, that there's a degree of warmth between us. You could call it small talk. You could call it talking about the weather, talking about how was your journey here type thing. Well, yeah, that may seem trivial, but there is some importance to it in that great meetings, as the saying goes, are built upon rapport, not necessarily upon agreement. Now, if you think about your client relationships in the broad range of clients and stakeholders that you have, you'll know that many of our relationships, stuff goes wrong. No plan ever survives contact with reality. Stuff goes wrong. But when we have that sense of rapport with people, then you can stretch that. There's room within business to allow for that. So building rapport, how do we do it? What do we mean by that? Well, it may be small talk. It may be the cliches of talking about the weather and how was your journey here. And I'm sure we could do better than that. But it's trying to find contacts. What we do as human beings is try and find contacts, those points of connection, any common ground that we have with people. And it doesn't have to be talking about sport, and it doesn't have to be what was on the telly or what's the latest box set. We can be a little bit more sophisticated than that, but we do it. The small talk, it may seem trivial, but we would argue it is pretty important. And it may well be counterintuitive that we have to step back a bit from what we might consider to be our sales agenda or the purpose of this meeting, just to allow that to happen. Now, we would argue that when does the rapport building stop? It stops when you get a signal from your client. You'll probably sense from your client, well, that's just about enough. And it's known as high context, some clients love loads of it. And it may well be that the bulk of the meeting is taken up in rapport. But if that's what the client wants, map and territory, go with the territory every single time, we would suggest. There's a lovely quotation about rapport from Maya Angelou, poet, genius, who said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And it's in that rapport side of the conversation that we can give a feeling of who you are, how you operate, how trustworthy, how open, vulnerable, wise, whatever it may be that you are. Those qualities come out in the rapport building side of the conversation. So allow that to happen by all means. You'll get a sense, I strongly believe that you'll get a sense from your client, maybe of the slightest little bit of impatience, maybe a raised eyebrow, a little check of the watch, or something like that will be enough to say, time to move on. Now, what we notice around the 3I meeting structure is that there are transitions. There are little speed humps along the way. Those speed humps can be a little awkward if you didn't know what's coming. And we got some help for you around the speed humps. And here's the first bit of help. Once you know that the rapport has come to an end because you've intuitively sensed it from your client, then have up your sleeve, check time. Relatively easy to do. When your client says, well, now, we said that we'd allow an hour for this meeting. Is that still about right for you? Relatively easy to have that close to hand. And it just makes that transition from small talk into what we might consider to be bigger talk, as it were, getting down to brass tacks and getting down to the meeting. So checking time, use your good sense around that. If your client is constrained for time, at what point does that constraint come so short that you think it might be wise to reschedule the meeting? But checking in with your client does no harm out of politeness. And that enables you then to get into the signpost. Now, we would say that the signpost is the agenda, if you will, for the meeting. We'll call it agenda or contract. Contract, really? We have contracts with our clients. Yes, we do. Now, this is the simplest, you might say, the gentlest of contracts, but there's some wisdom behind this. The signpost just says, this is what we are going to do in the time that we've allowed. Now, you know that if we have a good firm contract around a meeting, it's likely to head off in the right direction. And of course, in the signposting, there's room for consent, there's room for change of mind and opinion. And it may well be in setting out this agenda, this signpost, your client says, no, I don't want to do that now anymore. I'd like to do something else. And again, we'll go back with the territory. Really useful to put the signpost in place. And what does the signpost consist of? Well, it starts with, and I'm going to go ahead, just to give you a little flash, just to give you a little hint as to what's coming next. It starts with positioning. Now, positioning is our jargon, if you will. And positioning is credentializing, talking about us, saying who we are, the our side of things. So your signpost would say, we'd like to start by filling in any gaps you may have in what we do or what I do. Just to I suppose there's a courtesy around it, but there's also that sense of letting them know who you are. Now, there's some wisdom in the language that we use, and that wisdom is fill in any gaps. Why is that useful? Well, the alternative, we would like to talk to you about who we are or who I am, and that could end up taking the 78 slides, could end up taking quite a long time. Fill in any gaps is quite useful in terms of language, because it may well be that your client knows chapter and verse about you and your organization, and they don't need those gaps filling in or not filling in much. So the first thing we would say is that we, in our signpost, is we'll do some positioning. We wouldn't use that term, but talk about us and what you know about us. And then the signpost goes on to say, and this is where the contract comes in, we'd like to spend most of the meeting talking about you. Now, our small print around that, the language that we would use amongst ourselves is the investigate side of the conversation. Spend most of the meeting talking about you, finding out as much as we can about your needs, what's going on, what your issues and concerns are. Phrase it as you will, but you are saying we're going to spend most of our time talking about you, i.e. asking you lots of questions. And then there's a little bridge. This little bridge, boilerplated, we would suggest, is so that by the end of the meeting, we'll be able to come back to you, Inspire, and talk about how we may be able to help you. Now, that's where the contract starts to form, really. We're going to do something uncommon. Is it uncommon? I think it needs permission. We're going to ask lots of questions about you. Now, that may seem like an inquisition. It may seem intrusive. It may seem just downright rude. But you can get away with that, getting beneath the waterline, if you put the so that by the end of the meeting, we'll be able to talk about how we may be able to help you. There's a quid pro quo. There's a something in it for you. If you do this, we will be able to give you this. And this is the valuable thing, the glittering thing that our clients want from us. And I think if we put that little contract in place with a question at the end of it, does that sound about right? Point of consent, client can say, no, I just want to know what you do. Just give me the 78 slides, in which case go with the 78 slides. But that point of consent, yeah, no, that's about right. And what we agreed in our pre-meeting calls, for example, then you're home free. You've taken a relatively short amount of time in putting that in place. And then you get into the positioning itself, the positioning formally, which is when we say, right, so what do you know about us? Let's just fill in any of those gaps. That's one side of it. What do you know about us? Fill in any gaps. And the other bookend to this is, hopefully, that's painted a picture of where we are, what we do. And then that gives you permission to go into your first question and get into the investigate side of things.